welcome to my midnight panel. What was Animorphs about anyway? So I'll just start. How many of you have read any of the books? Love that, love to see it. How many of you have read all of the books? Let me see. Okay, that's still a good, way more people than I expected to have, so I'm impressed. So hang on, I grabbed a fresh mask before I left and I have not quite calibrated it yet, so I've got, all right, there we go. So let's find out what Animorphs was about anyway. So there were 64, I believe, books, 3 video games, a board game, a TV show, countless memes, and there was even a Taco Bell Kids tie-in. Do you guys remember that? Yeah, it was very short-lived. But what was the series actually about? So go ahead and get it started. So I don't know how many of you guys are older like I am and remember the Scholastic book fairs. But yes, absolutely, I was a book kid growing up, so this was absolutely a staple of my childhood. So me, 7 years old in 1997, wanders into the Scholastic's book fair, and there are a bunch of cool books with kids turning into animals on the cover. And I'm like, hey, I'm about that. And they had one where a girl turned into a horse. And I'm like, I'm not a horse girl, but I could be a horse girl. But not in the same way that this girl is a horse girl, but I need to know. So I innocently assumed that the series was like Goosebumps, and I could just pick up a book and it would be a standalone adventure about a girl who turned into a horse. But I was incorrect, and I had to go back and start from book 1. But it was published by Scholastic. Written by Catherine Applegate, as of the K.A. Applegate on the cover, and her husband, Michael Grant. They call them Apple Grant sometimes online, so if you hear me say that, that's just both of them together. They started publishing in 1996, and they ran through 2001. And these things, I'm going to drop the mic. These things were super cool. They were like the Ferraris of the cheapest books you could possibly find. So like, not only there was foil on the cover, there was awesome art of somebody turning into an animal on every cover. And then it had a little cutout in it, and then you opened it and there was a cool picture of the animal doing a thing. In this instance, it is a bat in a cave, which is like awesome that it had two covers. And then the best part, the corners, I don't think you can see it from here, but the corners were a flip book. And if you look in the corner, as you flip the book, the character in the corner would turn into the animal, which was super, like, that was so cool. Like, I saw that and I'm like, these books are the greatest thing I've ever seen. So there's a lot to be attracted to here. If you haven't read the series, you may be familiar with the series through the covers that get posted. A lot of people will take the covers out of context, and I love the me when the restaurant brings out bread for the table, and it's the kid turning into the duck. That's Marco, and he turns into a duck. Amazing. Yeah, just great. And I absolutely lost it when I saw the Barack Obama's summer reading list. That was just all the Animorphs titles plus the Banjo-Kazooie official guide. I was like, this is the most relatable thing I have ever seen in my life. That was a lot for me, that was. So if you're not familiar with the books, you may be familiar with the dank memes. But yeah, so let's talk about the plot. So the overall plot was, oh, hey, what do we got? Oh, fantastic. Thank you. All right, so on the topic of dank memes, I now have MAGFest, the deafening, phenomenal. Oh, here we go, absolutely love this. MAGFest, the machine, and he appears to be turning into a Jew beat. Bonus tune, ready, start. I love these, thank you so much. I was not prepared to have relatable dank memes dropped off for me. All right, so just a brief overview for anybody who hasn't. I'm gonna get into I'll get a little deeper into this, but so brain-controlling alien slugs have come to Earth, and they're trying to take over. And these 5 kids and their alien pal have to stop the invasion by turning into animals. Which is kind of a cool premise, because it's a little like War of the Worlds-ish, where you have these aliens come down, and you know, it's not like the military might that stops them, but like the power of nature. So you have these kids that turn into animals, and it's basically, you know, kind of like a Mother Nature herself is fighting back, because you've got like, the tigers are fighting the alien invaders. So it's a fun premise, It kind of gives me like National Geographic vibes, like let's learn about a different animal every book. We get to turn into them and learn about the animal through their eyes, and I'm sure nothing bad will happen. This sounds great. So book one, I'm just going to go through book one because I feel like it does a really great job of really setting the scene and getting you into the lore and everything that happens. And it really sets the tone, I think, for the rest of the series. So you have your 5 kids. There's Jake. Oh, hang on, wait. Let me see if I can. Yeah, so there's Jake. He's in the middle, in the green. And his best friend, Marco, in the white. And they're hanging out at an arcade, and they lose all their quarters. And they decide they're going to leave the mall. This is like the most 90s setup ever. And their friend, Tobias, he's in the red. They run into him, and Jake's like, hey, do you want to walk home with us? And he's kind of a loner. But Jake had saved him from some bullies who were trying to flush his head down a toilet, give him a swirly. Again, like how 90s can we make the opening of this book? We'll see. So they decide they're going to walk home together when they run into Jake's cousin, Rachel. She's in the green, right in the middle behind Jake, and her best friend, Cassie, who is in the overalls. That's a recurring theme. So they decide that they are going to walk home together, and they are going to take the shortcut through the abandoned construction site. And while they are taking the shortcut through the abandoned construction site, they see something in the sky. It lands, and an alien comes out, and they're like, is this happening? Is this an alien spaceship has really just landed in front of us? It is an Andalite. Ta-da! And he says, I am dying. I need to tell you this urgently. There is a secret invasion happening on Earth right now, and you guys have to stop it. And they're like, we are 5 12-year-olds. What can we possibly do? And he's like, well, about that, I will give you the power to turn into any animal if you can touch it and acquire its DNA, and then you can morph it. You can only be the animal for 2 hours at a time, but you get all the powers of the animal, plus you get to keep, your regular mind. So you control the tiger or the wolf or the gorilla. And they're like, this is a lot to handle. Like, we are literal children. And that is when another spaceship shows up, and their new alien friend is like, you guys gotta hide. You have to run. It lands, and another Andalite comes out, but he is not actually an Andalite. He is a Yeerk controller. So he's an Andalite, and a Yeerk has gone into his brain, wrapped around it, and is now controlling him. And this is kind of interesting because there is only one, and it is our main antagonist in the series. And he is wildly incompetent, but in this moment, he finally does something. So he lands, he taunts our new Andalite friend, and then he morphs into a giant, terrifying alien creature, picks our new friend up with his tentacles, puts him in his mouth, and just starts eating him. And this is described in graphic detail on page 32 of this children's book. Like, they started out at 100 and they never ramped it down. And the kids are like, wow, I'm kind of traumatized by this. We should run. And they take off. So they realize that they can touch an animal, acquire its DNA, morph the animal, and then they can stay as the animal for 2 hours. And they're like, that's great. Then they learn that their local youth group, The Sharing, is actually a recruiting front for recruiting human controllers, humans that are being controlled by a Yeerk. And of course, their vice principal is one of the main leaders of this group because it's a middle school children's book, so of course the vice principal is the bad guy. But my favorite part is throughout the series, we never find out who the principal is. I'm not really even sure that they have a principal because we never talk about him. It's always Vice Principal Chapman. They find out that Jake's brother, Tom, is also being controlled by a Yeerk and is a big member of the Sharing and is helping recruit humans to take an alien in their brain and then be controlled. So it's a little bit of like an Invasion of the Body Snatchers scenario. There's a lot of classic sci-fi that this really evokes because you have this running thread of anybody could be the enemy, anybody could have this slug in their brain and we'd never know, which is really interesting, kind of you've got these these middle school kids who are now dealing with absolute paranoia, and you've got Jake, who they all decide Jake's kind of the leader. So he's the leader of this Animorphs group, and he's living under the same roof as his brother Tom, who is a high-ranking controller. So you've got that whole situation. They find out that the Yeerks have a giant underground cavern below the city where there's a pool, and they have to go every 3 days to bathe in the pool and collect Candrona rays. Ooh, we'll get back to that one. And if they don't do this, they'll starve, basically. So Cassie's mother works at the zoo. So they go and they acquire a whole bunch of cool animals, and they get a lot of their classic battle morphs. Jake ends up with a tiger. Rachel gets an elephant for right now. Marco gets a gorilla. Jake gets the tiger, and Cassie's a wolf. Tobias decides he's going to stick with red-tailed hawk, and he's gonna stick with it a little longer than he thinks he might. So these 5 kids, again, they're like, 12, 13, decide to go down there, turn into animals, and fight the entire force of the alien invasion, which goes about how you think it might. A couple people get away, but for the most part, all they do is get their butts handed to them, and it's a bad time. And then, as luck would have it, one of the kids ends up staying past the 2-hour limit. Tobias ends up being stuck as a hawk. So he is now permanently... Oh, we also have our other 2 alien factions. We got our Taxons and our Hork-Bajir. The Taxons are ravenous centipede-like creatures who are wildly misunderstood and done so dirty throughout the series. And then, of course, we have our beloved Hork-Bajir, who are involuntary controllers and should be freed. The Taxons kind of get a bad rap because they tend to be voluntary. They voluntarily take a Yeerk into their brains. I would assume they have brains. I'm not sure how the Yeerk gets in there. They never really... Yeah, I don't know where it's going. Looking at that picture is not really making it clear to me. It's all right. Yeah, so it goes about how you'd expect. The series kind of devolves really quick into just absolute nightmare fuel, which makes me wonder, obviously none of our parents read any of these when we were children growing up, because, things get so hard so quick. The book opens with somebody getting eaten graphically, and then it just kind of goes downhill from there. We hit book 2, and so Rachel ends up morphing a shrew, and then later to catch a cat, to lure the cat in, and then she later ends up morphing the cat, and that night she has nightmares about being a shrew, eating maggots off a dead cat, and she wakes up, and she throws up, and her sister's like, "Are you cool?" And she's like, "Yeah, don't worry about it." And that's book 2. She's like, "Oh, I must have had a nightmare." And her 9-year-old sister is like, "Your nightmare was so bad you woke up screaming and then threw up? What, are you good? Was the math test that hard?" So we meet some friends. So book 10, we run into there's an entire race of dog robots, the Chi, and they are... Eric is our main Chi character. And so they are a race of pacifist robots, and their creators modeled them after dogs because the creators just loved the joy and innocence and love that the dogs portrayed. So they made this whole race of dog robots. So of course the first book we meet one, they disable the pacifist programming on this guy, and he goes on a rampage and just kills a ton of people. Is terribly scarred from it and says, "I'm not sure I'm going to help you again because, I'm now traumatized from turning off my pacifist programming and killing a whole bunch of people." Book 13's great. We got a highlight here. They meet an extra-dimensional alien who has got godlike powers, and he informs them that they are actually just chess pieces in a giant cosmic game of good and evil, and that he's the good guy, and that they're fighting against the bad guy who has his own forces. So the whole thing's Applegate and Grant loved Lord of the Rings, so there are a ton of Lord of the Ring references buried. So the main baddie is a Sauron look-alike, and a lot of the places and characters and names are actually based off of Lord of the Rings places. I think Elfangor is our main our alien that gets eaten at the beginning of book 1. And he was named after the Fangor forest. Fangor? I'm not a big Lord of the Rings fan, I apologize. Yeah, so the godlike alien shows up and says, hey, I'll give you back your morphing powers, because you can't get them back. Once you stay for 2 hours, you don't get the powers back. You can't just touch, there's a blue box that gives you the powers. You can't just touch the blue box and get your powers back. Like, you're stuck. But this magical godlike creature decides to give him his powers back, and it's great, it's great. So he's still a hawk, but then he can turn back into a kid for 2 hours at a time, or he can turn into other animals. So that comes into handy. Especially when we get to book 32, where they use the fact that he's stuck as a hawk but can still morph to expose a anti-morphing ray. And it's a bad time. Book 17, I actually have that one with me. Everybody gets addicted to oatmeal. Instant maple ginger oatmeal. It turns out that if the human controllers eat it, their yerk can survive without going back to the yerk pool, but the yerk ends up going insane. But it turns out there's another way they can stay alive without visiting the yerk pool, and that is eating other yerks. So they run into our main baddie, Visser 3's yerk brother, who has been engaging in some light cannibalism. Yeah, if he just keeps eating them, I guess he doesn't have to go back to the yerk pool. This is book 17. Like, there are like another 55 books here. Like, number 19, our friend Cassie gets stuck forever as a caterpillar, but don't worry, she gets better. That one's actually, so they have the whole yerk peace movement, and she meets a human controller that's a small girl, and she says, you know, you're enslaving this small child. And the yerk says back to her, would you live your life as a blind, deaf, helpless slug? And she goes, if it'll prove my point. So then she turns into a caterpillar, and she just decides she's gonna stay past the 2 hour limit, spend the rest of her life as a caterpillar to prove her point. And it turns out when you turn from a caterpillar into a butterfly, it's kind of like a natural morphing process, so they like trick it. So that's great, she comes back. Which brings us right into 20 to 22. They decide to add a new Animorph. There is a kid at school, and he finds the blue morphing box. It must have gotten thrown when the whole battle happened in book 1. And he's like, I'm gonna sell this on eBay. And the kids are like, oh, no, please don't sell this on eBay. It actually, if you touch it, you can turn into whatever animal you want. And he's like, all right, seems cool. Do I have a choice? And they're like, no, not really. So his parents get kidnapped, he gets kind of thrown into the whole situation, and it's debatable. There's a lot of good discourse around whether he is a sociopath or if he's just, you know, a good kid in a rough situation. Because they don't. So we have some opinions. He goes on a crime spree. He kills what he thinks is Tobias, but is actually just an innocent red-tailed hawk that was flying by at the time. He goes to the hospital where Jake and Rachel, who are cousins, their cousin is in the hospital. He's like 8, he has incurable cancer. David turns into their 8-year-old cousin to taunt them, and then when the actual 8-year-old cousin dies, he throws his body down an elevator shaft. Like, this dude's insane. So they decide that they can't have this guy running around. So they trick him into morphing into a rat, and then they put him in a box, keep him there past the 2 hour limit, and then drop him off on an island where a bunch of other rats live. Because like, hey, if other rats live there, he'll be fine. And then these rumors circulate that the island is haunted because he's just there on the island screaming in thought speak all the time because he's been trapped as a rat. Like, this is great. This is what we were reading as 7-year-olds. It probably explains a lot about me as a person. One of the ones that's you see a lot in the memes is where Rachel turns into a starfish, a girl turns into a starfish, and everybody's like, oh, Patrick Star, and there's all these memes about her turning into a starfish. Yeah, she beats somebody to death with her own severed arm in that book. It's fine, funny memes, guys. Cool books for 7-year-olds. One of my personal favorites is Megamorphs number 2. So they had a series of books that were released, like basically to be the summer vacation books. where they released them before the summer vacation happened, so the kids would have something to read, and they're kind of like out of canon, like they happen, but something happens to retcon them. So Megamorphs 2, they go back to the time of the dinosaurs, because what small child in the 90s did not love dinosaurs? So they all turn into dinosaurs, and they learn that aliens came to Earth, and they brought broccoli. Yeah, so. Yeah, and genocide. And so they are back in time, and they're meeting these great alien friends who live in the time of the dinosaurs, and they're like, this is great, we're all buddies. Isn't that meteor thing gonna happen and kill all the dinosaurs? I wonder what happens to our alien friends. And then they're like, I guess they didn't make it because there's no fossil record of our alien friends. Should we tell them? No, it's fine, let's just let the meteor hit them so everything goes back to normal. So yeah, they basically wipe out an entire race of friendly alien lobster critters, which is a running theme. There's just so much mass murder in these books, like so much. I was talking about it earlier, and I've got I got this Animorphs panel, and my partner was like, oh, that sounds nice, and I'm like, yeah, it was kind of a bad time. There's a lot of mass murder, and he was like, well, it really could have happened more than once, and I was like 5, maybe 7 times. Like it just keeps happening. Then there is the fever dream, that is Megamorphs 3. A controller finds something called the time matrix, which lets him travel through time, and he decides that he is going to travel back to the medieval times and kill a king, because his human host will not stop quoting Shakespeare. And he is like, if I kill this king, Shakespeare won't write a play about him, my host will stop quoting Shakespeare at me, and I will finally be able to live in peace. I don't know why that was the thought process. So he goes back in time, and the Animorphs are like, whoa, he screwed up the timeline. We've got to follow him. And so it leads to scenes like Jake is crossing the Delaware with George Washington and gets shot in the head. The gang kills Hitler. They end up in World War II, and Hitler's a truck driver, and they're like, oh my God, it's Hitler. And they're like, but he's just a truck driver. But before they can really hash out the moral implications of killing Hitler in the alternate past where he's just a truck driver, somebody kills him accidentally? One of the best scenes in the book is because they go back in time, they're in the racist South, and somebody makes a racist comment to Cassie because she's African American. And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, am I not white enough for you? And then she morphs a polar bear and threatens to eat the dude's face off. And she's like, is this white enough? Fantastic, one of the best scenes in the series. It's a shame it happened right in the middle of this absolute nightmare. So at the end of the thing, they go back in time to when his parents met and stop his parents from meeting, and they just erase the man from existence. But he's cool with it. It's fine. Just so much mass murder. The books kind of put us in a position where they frame the Andalites as good guys. And the first one we meet, Elfangor, he is a gem, and we like him a lot. And he sets up the whole book series by giving the kids the powers to morph. And they kind of say, listen, all we have to do is hang in there long enough for the Andalites to come and save us. But they're on the other side of the universe, so it's going to take them 3 years to kind of get here. So we just have to hold out for 3 years. They'll get here, and then they'll save us. But then as the series goes on and we meet more of them, we kind of understand that they're arrogant jerks, and their solution to a lot of problems is I'm just gonna kill it and then it's not my issue anymore. So for example, the Yeerks got loose. They were given the power of spaceflight, actually by an Andalite. And they go on to start taking over planets by infesting the minds of the local creatures. And one of those planets is the Hork-Bajir planet. We see them a lot as controllers. So they were taken against their will, and the Andalites were like, you know how we stop this in its tracks? That's right, we bioengineer a virus that will kill all of them. And then our problems are solved. How can the Yeerks use them as hosts if they're all dead? So they release this virus on the homeworld. It's like every fifth book. Every fifth book we're killing an entire race. It's phenomenal. So I hit some of the highlights, if you could call them that. I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys how the series wraps up. This is spoilers. You can cover your ears, you can walk away. I won't be offended if you don't want to know. I know a lot of us started reading as kids, and then it was 50 books, which was a lot for a kid to actually read or for a library to actually carry. So I know a lot of people didn't follow it through because it took them a couple years. And, reading these things at, grade 5 or grade 6, maybe they weren't as interesting to you in 2001 when you were a high school student and you kind of fell off. So I know a lot of people read a couple scattered books, but nobody really has the whole picture of like the long, protracted war. But so about 5 books from the end, the kids end up getting outed as humans, and they end up deciding that they need to go into hiding. So they go to the valley where they've hidden a whole bunch of free Hork-Bajir that aren't controllers, that are just living their lives eating tree bark and having a good time. And they hide their families there. And they decide that they need to do something drastic. So they end up recruiting a bunch of disabled teenagers as auxiliary Animorphs under the theory that the Yeerks will not see them as viable controllers because they are disabled, which is great, thank you for the ableism. They also end up meeting up with the growing Yeerk peace movement, and they say, hey, there's another way. You guys don't have to take over hosts. We'll give you the morphing power. You can morph something cool like a whale or an eagle, and then you don't have to rely on mind control to be able to see and not be a blind slug anymore. You can just turn into an animal, and that's cool. Like, that's what you're gonna be. You're gonna be stuck as that for the rest of your life. They also strike a deal with the Taxons to do pretty much the same thing. They say, hey, listen, I know you guys are always hungry, you hate your existence, you're always ravenous, like you literally cannot control yourselves around a piece of meat, like a steak is just, a Taxon feeding frenzy. What if you guys all turn into anacondas? Because anacondas only need to eat like once a month. And they're like, hey, that's a great deal. I have some problems with this. Again, I don't know I would call it mass murder, but we're essentially wiping out an entire species by having them morph into snakes. Like, that doesn't seem quite right to me, but maybe, your mileage may vary. So the Andalites do end up showing up, and they're like, oh boy, things look dire, but don't worry, we know how to fix this. And the Animorphs are like, you're gonna save us? And they're like, oh no, we're gonna blow up the planet. Sorry, guys. So they have to convince them to not do that, that they can win the war without the planet being blown up. And there's an epic showdown between Jake's brother Tom, who has been rising in the controller ranks, and Rachel, who is Tom's cousin, Tom and Jake's cousin, on the Blade ship, and they end up killing each other. Jake flushes the entire contents of the Yeerk mothership into space and kills I think it's 15,000, 20,000 Yeerks? I don't know that we ever settle on a number. Do we settle on a number? Yeah, again with the mass murder every couple of books. There are other solutions, you guys. So the Animorphs end up winning the war on Earth, but nobody really feels good about it. Everyone's super traumatized from being a child soldier because they were thrown into this whole debacle, this whole secret war at the age of 12. They couldn't trust anybody. They couldn't talk to anybody. They were constantly killing, alien and human controllers in animal form. One of the scenes that always sticks out to me is there's a scene where Cassie goes home after a battle, and she demorphs. She goes from a wolf back into a human, and her dad goes, oh, there's something in your teeth. And she's like, oh, let me get that. And it's a piece of flesh from a Hork-Bajir whose throat she ripped out. We were reading this as children. Who let us have these? Yeah. So the Animorphs do end up winning the war through a combination of peace movement talks and killing a whole bunch of maybe non-peaceful Yeerks. But everyone's super traumatized. Tobias leaves because Rachel's dead, and he was not comfortable with the fact that Jake sent her to her death, basically. Jake feels a lot of guilt about his role in the war as well, and he kind of deteriorates. There was a whole romance arc between Jake and Cassie, and that totally just implodes. She goes off to become kind of an alien ambassador and finds romance with somebody else. Marco, in true Marco style, writes a memoir about his life and then uses his morphing powers to star in movies and becomes a movie star. And then Axe, the Andalite of the bunch that they end up rescuing in book 4, goes off to be like a war general in the army. But like, nobody really feels great about it. So then the very end of the last book, they get a message that Axe has vanished. Their Andalite buddy that they've been with for 50 books has vanished. And will they be willing to go and save him? Because he's vanished in a part of space that's uncharted that the Andalites have agreed not to go into. And so they agree. So they get on a ship and they name it the Rachel because it's beautiful and dangerous like Rachel was. And they go off into uncharted space, run into this entity that is just slowly assimilating different ships and races that it runs across. And they decide their solution to fighting this thing is to just ram it with their ship. And then the book ends. It just ends on a cliffhanger. So we read, 64 books together. What did we learn? Boy, war sucks. Y'all, being a child soldier is hard. So I do think it's really interesting that the books present to us a lot of situations, and a lot of people will talk about it online, about how people, the Animorphs especially, made morally questionable choices. One of the big ones everyone always talks about is how ableist it was to go out in the later books and recruit a bunch of children who were teens who were disabled because the Yeerks would never take them as hosts. And it's a really morally questionable situation. Like, it's not great, but I think the point is that it isn't supposed to be great. I think it's supposed to make us wonder who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And we see this again and again and again. We think the Andalites are the good guys, and then they show up and they're like, our solution to the problem is nuking the planet. That's what we did with the other 6. And you're like, wait a minute. This whole series, we were waiting for them to show up and save us, and they're not gonna do that. We thought they were the good guys this whole time. But as the series goes on, we see more and more crimes that they've committed and more atrocities that they've committed, and we have to really wonder, are these the good guys who are gonna save us? And then we get the point of view of the Yeerks, where they're, especially in book 19, where the peace movement kind of starts, where Cassie has a one-on-one conversation with a Yeerk, where the Yeerk says, in my natural state, I am blind, I am deaf, I am a helpless slug. And then she says, would you give up your sight? Would you give up your hearing? Would you give up the ability to see color? Would you purposely cripple yourself like that? Would you not take the chance at freedom, even if it meant enslaving somebody else? And it's a really interesting commentary, and it really helps you see that what we thought at the beginning of the series was really starkly black and white is actually very nuanced. And there's a lot of gray morality mixed into these books. The characters make a lot of decisions that maybe we wouldn't make, or maybe are very hard, or are very morally ambiguous. So like we have in the final book, Jake makes the decision to flush a whole bunch of defenseless Yeerks into space and kill them. And you have to wonder, like a lot of people have been like, oh, semantics, it's not a war crime because you really think the Yeerks are subject to the Geneva Convention, but like, I'm gonna call it what it is. It was kind of a war crime. But it's understandable, like he's been traumatized, well, I mean, it's not understandable, but like we can at least see where he's coming from. He's been traumatized across 50-some books, and now he has the chance to really fight the enemy and to make a blow, and he takes it. And yeah, it's morally reprehensible, but like I think that's the point. Like I think these things were here to make kids think about the hard decisions. I mean, I don't know if like 7-year-olds really needed to be asking themselves if child soldiers placed in difficult situations were making the right decisions, but and it's really interesting because we get the point of view of a lot of the characters throughout the book. So we have Jake, who is kind of the leader. They don't really elect him. They all just say, we naturally know that Jake is going to call the shots. He's going to lead us. And Jake does it because everyone expects it of him. But then he struggles, He's making the decisions, he's calling the shots, and he doesn't always know if he's making the right decision. You've got Rachel, who is often portrayed as the bloodthirsty character, who's always the first to say, let's do it, who's always the first to rush into battle and take things out. But then when you get the books from her point of view, she's always questioning, I'm the one who's supposed to be bloodthirsty. I'm here to do it because nobody else will be. I have to be more extreme because this is a point of view that needs seeing. You've got Cassie, who is the pacifist, and I think it's really interesting that often you can look at what a writer is trying to say in a book by looking at how the characters' decisions end up and how the characters end up. So you look at this series, and you can argue that Cassie makes a lot of terrible decisions. She makes the decision that she's going to turn into a caterpillar and spend the rest of her life as a caterpillar in order to show the Yeerk that she is willing to make this concession. It's a great point, and it leads to the creation of the peace movement in a way. There was some peace movement bubbling happening, but it kind of really brings the Yeerk she talks to Aftran, really brings her into the fold and really kicks the whole thing off. And then she's able to just turn back into Cassie. There were no consequences for that terrible decision. And then it just keeps happening. She keeps making questionable decisions, but because she has the moral high ground, she feels justified. But then every time she makes a terrible decision, she's okay. There are no consequences for it. I mean, you could argue that Rachel getting killed was a consequence, but you could also argue that it was going to end up in that place anyway. But even at the end of the series, you see everybody is having a really bad time and is miserable and is super traumatized after the war, except for Cassie, who goes on to be, an alien, ambassador and finds love and is living more or less a normal life. Like, everybody else is ridiculously traumatized, crippled with their PTSD. There's a scene where Jake is doing so bad that they kidnap him and force him to morph a dolphin so he can feel some joy again. But Cassie's fine. And I think it really says a lot that is how Applegate set this all up. Because through the books again and again, we question whether Cassie is making the right decision. Everyone in the books questions if she's making the right decision. And then at the end, she's the only one who gets off. So I think it really says something, whether you agree with her position, the pacifist view, taking the gentle road when you could be bludgeoning people to death with your own severed arm. And then she ends up being all right because she stood by her morals. I don't know if I quite agree with it, but I mean, that's something that everybody's gonna kind of have to make a call on their own. But food for thought. All right, so we are at MAGFest. Let me talk about the games. On a lighter note, there were 3. There was a Game Boy game, a PC game, and a PS1 game. None of them really have a reputation for being great. I actually haven't played the PC game. It's more of a puzzle game, is my understanding, and that one seems to be the best. The PS1 game was basically a platformer where your only options were jump or die. Yeah, so you spend a whole lot of time jumping and collecting coins, and then every once in a while you'd run into a boss fight where you'd have to fight an enemy, but that was the game. You jump on platforms. You can go forward, you can go backwards, and you can just do a hop. And then there was the Game Boy game, which I actually played a lot of as a child because I was an Animorphs fanatic. I was obsessed. So of course I had to have the Game Boy game. I didn't own a PS1, but had to have the Game Boy game. And it has a rap for being ridiculously hard because it was basically a Pokemon clone. You can actually see it if you look at the very tiny center image in the ad. It was like a little, you had a fight, run, items sort of system. So you could use your fighting abilities to fight the alien baddies. But the alien baddies just picked their abilities at random. And sometimes they would just totally wipe you out. So the game has a reputation for being ridiculously impossible because you would just routinely go into a fight and get one shot rapidly. But there was a whole lot of it was pretty cool because there was a mini game where you were a bat and you'd go through a cave, and there was an overland map where you'd walk around and find different animals to acquire and morph and then solve problems and puzzles. But no, generally, I don't know if I would waste my time. There are also a ton of merch tie-ins. There was a board game. I don't know how many people actually know that there was a board game. Again, it was kind of cheesy. It was just a merch tie-in. It wasn't fantastic, but it was a thing. It came with really cool, gimmicky, lenticular cards where the kid would morph from a kid to an animal, so it was fun. They also had these awesome Transformer toys, which Didn't really look anything like a human, but hey, if you got like 3 of them, you could put them together to make a T-Rex. There was the Taco Bell kids meal tie-ins. I think there was also a Burger King meal, kids meal tie-in as well. There were jigsaw puzzles, and there were Animorphs kites. Like, and they didn't have birds on them. You think they would have like a bird on them, but they just have like Jake turning into a tiger. I mean, I had no idea there were Animorphs kites. I was looking for different merch, and I ran into these, and I was like, really? Who decided that was great? There were also folders, bookmarks. I think there was a calendar, journals. I had a bookmark. That was like my childhood treasured possession. There's also a TV show. And you would think that like a 1998 TV show based on the Animorphs would be terrible, but all of the episodes more or less followed book plots. So like as cheesy as the dialogue is and as bad as you can imagine the morphing 3D sequence technology of 1998 was, the plots of the shows stuck really close to the book, which is a lot more than you can say for a lot of media out there. And then actually the guy who played Jake went on to play Iceman in the X-Men. He was Gent in the Legends of Earthsea series on the Sci-Fi Channel, and then he's Lamplighter in The Boys. So he went on to have a successful career. None of the other actors in the series really did. The girl who played Rachel has been in a couple Hallmark movies that are like, you know, like The Year My Mom Found Love and like A Christmas with You. She's also got like a couple like episode bit parts, not to disparage her career, but I mean, it's not X-Men, it's not the X-Men movies. And the guy who played Marco as well went on to play, and Axe, both went on to play a couple minor like sitcom parts. So that was also a thing that was on the radar. Anyway, I'm sure you have questions after all of that. I'd love to talk to you guys about your experiences with Animorphs and what you took away from it. And anything you think I missed or failed to cover. So definitely, all right, we'll go. Okay. I did, yeah. I talked a little bit about it. I just wanted to hit it briefly. It's kind of hard to hit the plot of all 64 books. So I really just wanted to hit the highlights. Like, I talked about all of that, and I didn't even talk about the book where an ant accidentally walks across the morphing cube and then somehow acquires the ability to morph, and then morphs Cassie, and all it can do is scream. Yeah. Which, yeah, there's also the water buffalo. I mean, which is super relatable. Like, if I was an ant and then suddenly I was a human, I would probably also do nothing but scream. There was also like there were 2 tie-in books that were absolutely filler. Sorry, my glasses keep fogging up, so I'd love to see you guys. There were 2 tie-in books that were basically filler, where these really tiny aliens called the Helmicrons showed up, and then they shrink. They want to use the morphing cube as a source of power for the ships, and the Animorphs are real obnoxious, so they shrink them down to like ant size, and then they have ant size adventures. And then the second one, they go inside of Marco, and it is like a magic school bus in What's Inside the Body episode. And so they're like going through, like so much horrible stuff happens that I cannot cover it in an hour panel. They turn into ants, and the whole thing is just a horrible experience. And like there's a whole ant war, and they're like I don't even know what book it's from. There's a scene where Marco turns into a monkey, and then he gets cut in half, and he has to watch the back half of him fall away, and he's like, I should demorph. Yeah, that would be a great idea. Though, you know, that never really talk about what happens to all the limbs they lose. Like, are they just like cleaning up the Yerk pool later, and they're like, oh boy, another grizzly bear arm. How do they keep getting in here? Or like if their limbs turn back to human, or do they just disappear? You know, they never really discuss it. There's lots of food for thought there. But I had, all right, in the front.
So, real quick, traumas you missed is probably the traumas and war crimes list.
It was not exhaustive. The traumas and war crimes list was not exhaustive. As I said, I just hit 3 books right there.
Book 6, in which they kidnap Jake to start a Yerk
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, in book 6, they're using a hospital as a front to force people to be controllers. Like, you come in for tonsil removal and they just dunk your head in a mini yerk pool. That's a jacuzzi. So they turn on the jacuzzi and boil these yerks, but then Jake gets knocked out and one of them escapes into his head. And they're like, oh boy, Jake's a controller. Well, the only solution is to tie him up in a cabin in the woods for 3 days until the yerk starves to death. Yeah, it's not great. I didn't even touch on, Marco's mother is actually a controller. Yeah, so book 5, Marco finds out his mom is actually Visser 1, one of the highest yerk you can be without being on the Council of 13. And yeah, she faked her death, started a new family with some guy she met and then had kids with him because she was real into being a human. And they were like, are you maybe too into being a human? And there was an entire book about it called Visser. So, way in the back.
Hello. I think one of the choices that they go over in the last book that always messes with me is the fact that they have been pleading with Tobias for years to just change back into a human and restart his life, because one of the things that goes on in his monologue, he's like, oh yeah, red-tailed hawks only live to be like 13, and I don't have much time, and I don't know what I want to do about that.
Yeah.
Like, they address the fact that Tobias is most likely going to die as a bird.
Yeah, it's not ever really clear if he gets his original lifespan or if he's going to only have the bird lifespan, but it's like kind of implied he might only have the bird lifespan. But there is also like giant alien demigod nonsense going on there, so like, there's a lot of tension about Tobias deciding to stay as a hawk through the series, and a lot of the threads of his books kind of run like, I was neglected and abused as a child. Why would I want to go back to being a human when I could fly in the sky and be free? And then there is also a lot of tension with his romantic interest, Rachel, baby's first ship. And I love them together. This is ride or die. They deserve each other. I want them to be happy. It doesn't happen because it's Animorphs, but I love them together. And there's a lot of tension between him and Rachel because she's like, I wish we could have a normal relationship. And he's like, you're gonna have to deal with the fact that I can only be human for 2 hours at a time. And there's a scene where they go to the school dance together, and they're dancing together, and he realizes that he only has like 3 minutes to turn back into a hawk, and maybe accuses her of trying to trap him as a human so they can have a normal relationship. And she's kind of like, that wasn't my intent, but like, we never really know. We never really know if she was like subconsciously thinking if he's stuck as a human, we can have a normal relationship. But they also, it's heavily implied that they go on flying dates together, which is adorable, which is where Tobias just comes over and Rachel turns into an eagle and they just fly around together and chat and like have a nice time flying, which is really cute, like absolutely gets me. I love them together. And then, let me go back to over here. It has, yeah, so I started a series reread recently, which is what kind of inspired me to come back and do this panel. I have not actually gotten there yet, so it has been like, maybe like 15 years since I've read that one. But yeah, so the whole thing is implied to be like a galactic chess game between this demigod, the Elemist, and Krayak, his evil enemy. And they have different pieces of the puzzle, different chess pieces that they can move around and make work. And one of the Elemist chess pieces is the Animorphs. And he was kind of forced into the position, if I remember right. Like, he didn't really have a choice. He's like the only survivor of his race, and now he's stuck playing this game for like the heart of the universe. Like, the heart of the universe. Is it going to be good or is it going to be evil? Like, which direction will it go? And yeah, it kind of sucks that like the kids kind of get roped into a war that they don't know anything about with the Yeerks and the Andalites, and then again roped into a war they don't really know anything about with Elmis and Krayak. I mean, that's more or less what I've got for you. I'm sorry, I wish I'd reread that one more recently. And then, oh my God, there were two choose your own adventure books. Everybody kind of universally hates them. I am gonna be the naysayer. I love choose your own adventure books. They were stupid. There wasn't really any adventure, but oh man, I was an Animorph and I was making Animorph choices. Yeah, no, 8-year-old me was sipping the choose your own adventure. A lot of people will just pretend that they don't exist and that they're not canon. They're not. But a lot of people just pretend they didn't happen. Another thing that I thought was really interesting that I find a lot of people don't know that I actually only found out recently is Megamorphs #2, The Time of the Dinosaurs. When I went to the Scholastic Book Fair, they had like 4 copies of it, and I was like, yes, I'm getting my copy. And I popped open that bad boy, and there's a beautiful illustration of all of the characters on the inside cover and their dinosaur morphs or whatever it was. I did not find out until last year that there were 6 variants. There was one with all of the kids and then with all of the kids together. So I actually had to go out and find the Rachel specific one online because she's my favorite character. So I was like, I need to have the Rachel one. But yeah, I had no idea. That one took me by surprise, and I think a lot of people didn't realize that there were so many variant covers of the Megamorphs book. I don't know that I would suggest you collect them all, but I actually went and completed my physical series. A couple years back, I kept having these bizarre recurring dreams that I would go to the bookstore and there would be a bargain bin of Animorphs books, and I'd be going through the bin looking for Animorphs books, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat and I was like, the books are only gonna get more expensive. So I went through and I got the ones that I was missing from my collection. Yeah, I know I'm up here giving an Animorphs panel and I'm like, I had a dream. In the dream, the Animorphs were there, and I turned into a cheetah. But like that is how into the series I was as a child. And even now, when I look at myself and what I like in media, I find myself trending towards things where everybody dies, and there's a whole lot of gray morality. And I'm like, gee, I wonder where that came from. Shocking that this molded me as a human fundamentally. But I actually went out and collected my series. So you can still get a lot of the books secondhand at secondhand books or online places. Some of them are really expensive. So the book, I'm gonna go all the way back. The book where Marco turns into a duck, me when the restaurant brings out bread for the table, that book was $50 online. I don't know why. There's 2 copies up on eBay and they were both $50, and then somebody bought one. And the guy selling the other one was like, well, now there's only 1 copy on eBay, so $150 it is. So I luckily found one for $2 at my local library book sale. So that was one of the big things I needed to complete my collection was the $50 Marco Turns Into a Duck book. But yeah, so you can find them all online. And yeah, so yeah, there were a couple early book covers where the model for Marco had really shoulder length hair, and I thought it was adorable and the most 90s thing. And then they had the model cut his hair. They actually changed the kid models on the front covers for a couple of the books. I think Cassie was the only one that stayed through. So there was I think it was a Reddit AMA a while back with the girl who was the cover model for Rachel. And she was talking about how, so she was talking about how they were with a modeling agency and they would show up and they would pose, and then they'd take the photos and turn them into the morphing photos from the front covers. There was an artist, David Mattingly, did most of them, and he would take the pictures of the kids, but then they decided that the kids were getting too old and slowly replaced them one by one, or the kids would go off to college, and so they would replace them one by one. And so they kind of just had to take whoever showed up for the modeling gigs. So Tobias is described as being kind of a nerdy kid with dirty blonde hair in the books, but then that was what they used for the Tobias cover model. Yeah, so they were I don't know, this guy just showed up and that was what we had, so we went with that. Like, he's wearing a watch. The kid's stuck as a bird. Do you think he needs a watch? Like, do you think he's wearing, like, do you think he wears a watch? I think they did a great job with the original cover models, and I didn't really like when they changed them as, like, a personal thing. But it was really interesting to hear her talk about the experience. Like, she basically showed up, posed, they took a couple pictures, and then she got paid and she left. And it was the same for all the kids. And then they just got replaced one day and nobody told them. They just said, oh, stop showing up, you're fine. All right. Yeah, so he's got the 2-hour limit there. So yeah, if anyone is going to be conscious of the 2-hour morphing limit, I agree, it would be Tobias. I'm sorry, am I ignoring this side of the, go ahead.
Can we go back to when they got the auxiliary Animorphs and then found out that half of them had their disabilities cured after they went back into human, but then they pretended that they still had their disabilities and stayed at the home they were at?
Yeah.
Like the next book, they then went to an army base and told them, hey, we're here to fight this war. We have to lock everyone in the army base up in 3 days so all the Yeerks starved to death. And like half of the base was like, yeah, dude, that sounds pretty chill. We can do that.
Yeah, no problem. Like,
I mean, at that point, they're spaceships. But it's not
yeah, at that point, like, the war is in full swing. But yeah, no, it's really interesting because, like I said, we've got our characters making moral decisions. Like, we're going to recruit disabled teenagers, which I think is one of the more questionable things that happens in the book. But, like, I think that's supposed to be the point. Like, I think you're supposed to, like, I felt uncomfortable with that decision. But I think you're supposed to. And then, like, 2 books later, they're like, hey, you guys turn into animals. We'll use you as a distraction. They all die. And then our main Animorphs 5 just go on about their day, and, well, 6. Our main Animorphs 6 go on about their day, and the entire auxiliary Animorphs are wiped out, and, like, we just don't ever talk about it. Like, but I think it's supposed to be, I think it's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. Like, I think the entire point is war is hell, and you have to make hard and bad decisions, and there are no good decisions, especially when people are dying. Like, you're fighting Yeerk controllers, and you have to kill the Taxxon or the Hork-Bajir bodies, even though the hosts aren't doing this. They're just puppets that are, you know, piloted by this slug. And I think it's like, you know, it's asking the hard questions. And I mean, again, like, I don't know if you want to really be answering the hard questions for yourself as a 7-year-old, but I think it definitely gave, I think kids are a lot brighter than we give them credit for. And I mean, I didn't have, you know, I had some thoughts about this as a small child.
So, I did not get to enjoy Animorphs growing up in the kid. I thought it was a deep type book like you said earlier. And about 2 months ago, I learned that was not the case. And so, hearing this panel was going to happen, I was speaking very excited. And this panel has been 100% of my education on Animorphs entirely. So my question is, and maybe I heard you wrong, but are the Yeerks even bad? Because I thought, like, you said there was, like, volunteer, like my character's kind of scary, but, like, were there good?
Yeah, so there are a number of volunteer controllers. Like, I mean, if you could just, like,
What were they doing that was bad?
not have to control, well, they did involuntarily. Yeah, there were some volunteer controllers, but the bulk of the Yeerk forces were involuntary controllers. So they were basically enslaving people. So, like, maybe their reasons were right, but, like, is there really a right reason to take away somebody's freedom? Like I said, the whole series, they're really framed as, like, body snatching, like, planet taking over nightmare monsters, book 1, especially when we see their leader is an incompetent idiot. But then, like, as you go through the series, you're exposed to another point of view. And like I said, I think that's the point. Like, I think, you know, we start out with this Yeerk bad, Andalite good, and then at the end of the series, the Andalites show up and they're like, we're gonna blow up your planet. And half the Yeerks are like, well, let's find a peaceful solution to, oh, sorry, I saw it going. They're like, half the Yeerks are like, let's find a peaceful solution to this problem. So definitely very interesting, a lot of food for thought. I think I'm about out of time, but I'll stay here for as long as they let me. Yeah, go for it.
So I'd be interested to know what you think the most, I don't even know how to phrase this, but the most, like, stressful book to read. Because for me, that's the one
Oh, boy.
where Tobias thinks he has a cousin that he's never heard of. And the play-by-play of him with her in the lawyer's office. And he actually says that
Yeah.
And that's what saves him.
Yeah, yeah. There are no good Tobias books, really. They are all hard. I do want to stress that there are lighter in content Animorphs books. Like they're book 14, my first book, where Cassie turns into a horse. She turns into a horse to infiltrate Area 51 because they have an alien artifact. They get into Area 51. They run through the hangar as horses while the generals are like, oh my God, get the horses out of the hangar. And they find the alien artifact and they're like, it's the alien artifact. What is that? I don't know. And they go home and they're like, we did that whole mission and I don't even know what we saw. Like, what was the alien artifact? And their Animorph member, Axe, goes, oh man, that was an Andalite toilet. Like, that's it. The whole book is just a punchline, is that they've got this alien artifact and it's a toilet. Like, okay, that's fine. I think I'm at time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you so much for stopping by, guys. I know it's late, but but yeah, no, this is something that was my childhood and is near and dear to my heart. So I love that I could come and share just a little bit of it with you guys. They're doing comic releases now of the books, where they're making each of the books a graphic novel. Those are worth checking out. They're doing audiobooks of all of the books one by one. I think they're in the 30s. And if you do some Googling, I think they're going to be putting the entire series on the new K.A. Applegate website in PDF form. I don't know if that's happened yet, but I think they said once the rights revert to them, they're going to do that. So you can read it all online. But yeah, no, thank you so much, guys. It was great to be able to chat about it. Have a good MAGFest, everybody.